Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. Today's guest is a multiple New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of science fiction thrillers that have sold over 2 million copies. I was initially introduced to him through his book, Seeker, which left a very refreshing view on the future of humanity. After reading Seeker, I asked him for a recommended next read, and he suggested the newly released Unidentified, a book that opens and closes with the author participating in a large podcast. He had me at the word podcast. He has gone from being a biotech executive and director of biotechnology, licensing with a BS in microbiology from the Ohio State University and a master's degree in genetic engineering from the University of Wisconsin, where he engineered mutant viruses now named after him. No, his name is not Corona, and an MBA from the University of Chicago, to now being an international best-selling author. That provides amazing material for this podcast. Welcome, Douglas E. Richards.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Great to be here.
Yeah, this is, when you said that your most recent book, which we're going to be talking about, Identified, opened with the author protagonist in the book speaking on a huge podcast, I was very excited to read this book. So it's going to definitely be a challenge to get all I would like to discuss with you in only an hour, but here we go. One of the things that I guess we'll talk about, because it is a brand new release right now, Unidentified, a little bit about that, and then also how you came up with this idea, because it's almost like you're challenging fate to have near future science fiction.
You mean so I might get scooped by actual yeah, exactly. No, that's I did that. I even mentioned that in the notes to Unidentified. So the idea for Unidentified, I've been a long skeptic of UFOs, and I love science fiction all my life. So I kind of always wished that they were here and we could meet extraterrestrials, but I didn't think it was ever going to happen, and I didn't think this was real. And then that changed recently, and I was converted from a skeptic to a real believer, and I can go over some of the reasons why. But so I became kind of obsessed with the subject, and I decided, you know what, I need to get the data out there to show people, because I was unaware of the evidence that's come out recently that just blows my mind. And I thought, well, as kind of a public service, I should write a novel that kind of describes the revelations that have come out that make it, just inarguable that these things are real in my mind. So I started. So I had the idea that I would start with the kind of the factual part and then go into heavy science fiction after that, thrillery elements and action elements and all that. But I would start with a science fiction author like myself, who had become obsessed with UFOs like myself, going on a podcast like this one. With a huge audience like yours, and the idea would be that would allow me in the first 30 pages on the podcast to describe the evidence that I'll probably be describing on this podcast. But I described that in the beginning of the novel of why UFOs are real and what has been seen, but the author in the novel, the protagonist, has a plan, so he's bluffing. He goes on. He tells the audience about all this information about UFOs and why they're real. And then he tells the host, he says, look, I know exactly what's going on. I know why the aliens are here, what aliens are here, where they're from. I know every detail of what's going on. And, the next time I come on your show in a week or two, I'm going to disclose everything. Okay. But he's bluffing. He doesn't know anything. He's been trying, but he's failed, and he hasn't learned anything. And so his bold idea is to kind of lure people, use himself as bait, and hope that one of the millions of listeners is maybe an alien or a government official or somebody who really does know what's going on and who doesn't want him to spill the beans. So they're listening in and they say, wait, we have to find out if this guy really knows what's going on, or if he does, maybe we kill him so he doesn't disclose it. So he's using himself as bait, and he hires a mercenary team to protect him while he looks innocent and waits for them to come after him, hoping to turn the tables and interrogate them and find out what's going on. So that's kind of the beginning of the novel. And then it branches off into speculation about what's going on, and science fictional and thriller elements after that.
Yeah, one thing that was for me, because I read the Kindle version, and what's nice about Kindle is that you can have hot links in whatever you're reading. And you had the 2 links to the already existing patents on this UFO technology with the US Patent Office. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, John, let me back up a little bit. That was kind of the piece de resistance. I mean, that was like the final piece of the puzzle for me that just cemented that these things are real. Absolutely. But if I can back up a little bit, if you don't mind, I can kind of walk through, what made me a believer, because like I said, I could not have been more skeptical of UFOs. And I was skeptical because, interstellar distances are vast, and the nearest star is 40 light years away. And I believed that the light speed barrier couldn't be broken. I believe that Einstein was right and now I'm kind of questioning that, because we have new discoveries about dark energy, which is a repulsive force and anti-gravity force. And you can actually, create wormholes using a repulsive anti-gravity force. You can manipulate space-time. And so I'm starting to believe that you can bypass the speed of light, but for a long time I thought it was impossible. And the nearest star is 4 light years away. That would take, I did the calculation for Unidentified, the novel, to put in there that if you were in a 747 traveling at 500 miles an hour, it would take over 5 million years to go to the nearest star. And that, that's without refueling or, getting pretzel snacks for the passengers. And what are the odds that there's intelligent life on the nearest star? It's probably 1,000 times farther away even than that. So I didn't think it was possible. And then I thought, well, if anybody could bridge the interstellar gulf, and they had the technology to come here, well, number one, they'd be able to destroy us. We would be helpless. But importantly for this discussion, they would be able to conceal themselves. They would have the technology to conceal themselves. So if they wanted to be found, they would just land on the White House lawn and introduce themselves and hold a press conference. And if they didn't want to be found, they could conceal themselves. I'm absolutely convinced that if they had that technology, they could absolutely conceal themselves. So why this middle ground? Why are they letting themselves be seen here and there? But so anything is possible. But that really troubled me. And in fact, that's one of the questions that I set out to answer fictionally in the novel. Is to explain that. And then finally, I just don't trust that all the governments of the world would be able to hide something like this. But again, I became a believer. So I started a skeptic, and I just to review, the evidence. If you're okay with that, of what changed my mind. Okay, so I think what the real turning point for me and a lot of people was the avalanche of evidence that came out after 2017. So in 2017, Chris Mellon, who was the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, met an unnamed person in a Pentagon parking lot. And they gave him 3 military videos of UFO encounters, 2 of them in 2015 and 1 of them in 2004, which is the famous Nimitz encounter that you may have heard about. And basically the video showed footage of UFOs doing one impossible maneuver after another. I mean, vehicles with no wings, no propellers, no heat signatures, no visible means of propulsion, and yet they were able to hover for long periods of time, change direction instantly, accelerated G-forces that would turn us into paste, and then travel at ridiculous speeds through not only space and air, but even underwater. I mean, which just kind of mind-blowing to me. And so they don't obey the known laws of physics. They're observed by multiple trained military personnel and a variety of technologies. So this Chris Mellon gave these videos to the New York Times, and at the end of 2017, they did a front page story, which really kind of blew the lid off of what was going on. And I can describe a little bit more about the New York Times story, but before I do that, and that led to stories on 60 Minutes and all kinds of freedom of information requests that revealed even more information. But let me just talk about the Nimitz encounters, then I'll get to the patent as well at the end, because that I think is the most compelling piece. So in November of 2004, the Nimitz Strike Group was conducting a training exercise off the coast of San Diego. And that was the Nimitz, which was an aircraft carrier, a guided missile cruiser called the Princeton, 2 destroyers, and an attack submarine, and thousands of sailors, and all kinds of jet fighter squadrons and jet pilots. So it was a major force. And they detected as many as 100 UFOs in low Earth orbit during those 2 weeks. And by the way, John, I should mention that I use the term UFO, but the government has stigmatized that and made it publicly, kind of made it seem like anybody who believes in UFOs is a crackpot. And so because now that their government's taking it more seriously, they've introduced new terms to more legitimize it. So they now have UAP, which is unidentified aerial phenomena, and UAV, which is unidentified aerial vehicle. So those are also terms that that are kind of more popular right now. But I still like to use UFO. So anyway, these things, they saw hundreds of them in near Earth or low Earth orbit. Every once in a while, a bunch would descend to 28,000 feet, which is about 5 miles. And then occasionally, some of these would dart to sea level or even below the ocean. Now, that's 5 miles, and they would do this. They would go 5 miles to sea level in less than a second, which is just absurd. It's just ridiculous speed. So finally, the government dispatched 2 F-18 Super Hornets, and 4 pilots observed this tic-tac shaped craft kind of skimming above the surface of the ocean for 5 minutes. And then it just kind of blinked away. It just kind of traveled so fast it all but vanished. And it was picked up a few seconds later, 60 miles away on radar. So all of this kind of stuff, it was observed by suborbital radar, the ballistic missile defense radar systems on the Princeton, infrared video, other radar systems visually. And even though this isn't official, the rumor is that the sonar on the submarine, the submarine that was accompanying the strike group caught the craft going underwater at ridiculous speeds. So, John, that's the first piece. When I started reading about this, and all the different ways that they were seeing this, I became, a believer. And then when I was doing even more research for Unidentified, when I decided I was going to write this novel, this science fictional novel about UFOs, I read this scholarly article that as you know, as having read the novel, is also mentioned in the novel. And by the way, in the notes, I have links to all this stuff. And in the notes, I have an extensive reference list with links, so people can look at all this stuff themselves. But I read a scholarly article that had lots of calculations and equations called, the title was Estimating Flight Characteristics of Anomalous UAVs in the 2004 Nimitz Encounter. And I'll just read a few paragraphs from that to give you a taste of this. Because this really started cementing in my mind the reality of these things. So it starts off, a number of UAP encountered by military, commercial, and civilian aircraft have been reported to exhibit impossible flight characteristics, such as traveling at extremely high speeds, changing direction or accelerating at extremely high rates, and hovering motionless for long periods of time. Furthermore, these craft appear to violate the laws of physics in that they do not have flight or control surfaces, any visible means of propulsion, and can operate in space, air, and water without apparent hindrance. We consider the 2004 UAP encounters with the Nimitz carrier group off the coast of California. We estimate the most probable acceleration of the craft to be over 5,000 Gs.
Wow.
So I think we all know that 10 or 20 Gs is the most that a human can survive for a minute. And even to survive those kind of Gs for a minute, you have to have special suits, you have to be trained pilot. So 5,000 Gs is ridiculous. And then they go on to say that they calculate, and again, they show the equations, a speed of 46,000 miles an hour with no observed air disturbance, no sonic booms, and no evidence of excessive heat. And just to put 46,000 miles into perspective, that's about 13 miles a second, or going around the world and getting back to your starting point in a little over 30 minutes. And then John, the last paragraph, and then I'll move on. But the fact that these UAVs display no flight surfaces or apparent propulsion mechanisms and do not produce sonic booms or excessive heat that we expect should be involved strongly suggests that they're taking advantage of technology or physics that we are unfamiliar with. For example, the Tic Tac UAV dropping from 28,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds involved at least 430 billion joules of energy, which is equivalent to 200,000 pounds of TNT released in 3/4 of a second. One would have expected a catastrophic effect on the surrounding environment.
Wow. Yeah, that's I was fascinated with your research because I read the end of your book too, with you had your research notes and how you came upon that. It was fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was fascinated. I mean, I didn't expect it. I mean, I was obsessed just based on the Nimitz encounter and the New York Times article and the following stuff. But then when I read, as I did research, so the Nimitz was number one. Then just a real quick, the New York Times talked about this UFO program called ATIP, or Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And that was initiated by former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid in 2007. And he went, after the New York Times story was published, he said, I'm glad the Pentagon is finally releasing this footage, but it only scratches the surface. Most of the evidence hasn't seen the light of day. And he said that other countries were way ahead of us when it came to investigating UFOs. And then finally, he said that we've got stunningly good pictures of them. And then this is a quote, John: "We can't turn our heads and pretend they don't exist, because they do exist." So this was the Senate Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate. So, and other high-profile people like John Radcliffe, of the Director of National Intelligence, kind of said this pretty much the same thing. And then the New York Times story disclosed that for over a decade, the Pentagon was giving briefings about this to congressional committees and to aerospace executives, talking about military sightings that performed of craft that performed in ways that were thought to be impossible. So that leads me, and I know I'm long-winded, I apologize, but that brings me finally to answering your question about the patents. One more quick sidetrack, and then I'll get there. So the Nimitz was the number one thing that convinced me. But then number two, after the Freedom of Information request came out after the article in the New York Times, the Defense Intelligence Agency released some scholarly work that they were working on that just blew my mind. And I put, again, you've read it, John, because it's in the novel. But let me give you the titles of these papers that they've released that any of your listeners can look up. Just Google it, or if they get the book, they can just click on the link provided. But here's the title: Warp Drive, Dark Energy, and the Manipulation of Extra Dimensions. Warp Drive, Dark Energy, and the Manipulation of Extra Dimensions. This isn't a science fictional thing. I didn't write this in a science fiction book that's set 2,000 years in the future. This is the Defense Intelligence Agency treatise, and you can read it, and it's not kidding around. The second is traversable wormholes, stargates, and negative energy. Stargates. And then the third is advanced space propulsion based on vacuum, space-time metric engineering. So, reading those papers blew me away. Totally. I was just, my jaw dropped to the ground. But then I hit upon, in researching Unidentified, what you had just described, the UFO patents. So finally, I'm getting there. These are two patents that were issued to the Navy itself, the U.S. Navy, in 2018. The first is a patent basically on what I just described, the Nimitz saw. So a craft that can travel through space, air, and under the water, no visible means of propulsion, no heat signatures, basically everything that I described, this is a patent on it. And I mean, it's hard to imagine this isn't just the Navy reverse engineering something. And of course, the patent office rejected it. The patent office said, you're out of your mind. This is impossible. And so even more interesting, in my view, is that the Navy's chief patent attorney, Mark Glutt, appealed the decision. He submitted further documentation, which we've never seen, but he assured the patent office that the craft was enabled, which meaning that he convinced them that this could actually be built. He gave them compelling evidence. Look, we're not just making this stuff up. This can actually be built. Now, that's not to say that it has been built, but he convinced the patent examiner that it could be, and they issued the patent. And again, you can read, just like you said, John, you can read this patent yourself. And yeah. And then the second patent is it's like a force field, like a shield from Star Trek. And let me read one line from this patent that I just talked about. My mind is still blown. So this invention would also enable us to engineer the fabric of our reality at the most fundamental level. The fabric of reality. I mean, so you go to this, I've got the patent number in there if you want to Google it. You go there, you click on it, Google fabric of reality, and you'll find this in the patent. It's an issued US patent. That's that's bold language for a science fiction author to use. It's in an issued patent. And then the second patent about this field generator, there's a sentence, it is a feature of the present invention to provide a method and apparatus for generating an impenetrable defensive shield. Impenetrable. Again, super bold language. So when I read, those DIA papers about wormholes and stargates, when I read these patents that have been issued, and when I saw, the 60 Minutes segments where they interviewed the pilot of the Nimitz, who saw the UFO in that encounter, and saw all this information that I uncovered for the novel, I mean, I am absolutely could not believe in this stuff more, and I was the biggest skeptic in the world.
Yeah, it's you read the book and it's science fiction, it's near future science fiction, but then when you have what you put in there, it's you weave that fine line between science fact and science fiction, so that someone who is a disbeliever can go, okay, I'm just reading science fiction, but then it kind of like it starts to really open up that door of disbelief in the degree that it's been denied in the at least from the government sources. Even that last paper that came out last year, which alluded that there were 5, I think it said there was 5 that couldn't be explained, but everything else they tried to put a label on or tried to explain. But at the very end, then there was, I think there was 5 different examples that they couldn't explain. So while they didn't say that, yes, we believe in this, at least it's next step in at least not wholeheartedly discrediting the subject.
No, they're taking it a lot more seriously. And again, my goal was to write the factual stuff in the beginning on a podcast exactly like this one, which makes me laugh even now. And then write a real entertaining novel with lots of twists and turns and fun speculation, because I wanted it to do well, and so I could reach more people, because I believe that all 7.8 billion of people on the planet should be standing up and demanding to know what's going on at this point. And so I kind of wanted to do a crusade here, and so I used what I hope to be an entertaining novel as a foil to get this information across. And so far the feedback has been really positive beyond my greatest hopes. I get emails all the time that say, hey, my mind is blown. I now that I've read this stuff, I believe in UFOs too. So so far it's been working. I've been really happy with what's going on with it.
Yeah. So now on this, do you think you've gone too far with your speculation? Because you said that you strive to be scientifically accurate. Do you feel like in this and also in Seeker, and those are the only 2 that I'm familiar with, but do you feel like you've gone too far with your speculation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So early on in my career, I worried, am I being too optimistic about human capabilities, about, our inventive ability? Will science really ever be able to do this? Am I writing about impossible things? Because again, like you said, I really care that this is possible, that it's scientifically accurate, that it's, it's not just fantasy. So I really thought about it hard, and I came to the conclusion. Well, let me back up and say, I'll give you an example. So I use nanites in a number of novels, nanobots, tiny microscopic little robots. And, the idea is, they're like 3D printers, except better. So a 3D printer can kind of layer by layer build something out of plastic. These can kind of do it at the atomic level. They can just kind of grab onto atoms and molecules like Legos and build whatever you want them to build. So if you have a nanite, and this is how I did it in my novel, you can have a single microscopic little robot, you throw it into the ground, it can gather up whatever it needs from the ground to make a copy of itself. Whatever molecules it needs, it pulls them together and it makes a copy of itself. And then those 2 can make, 4 and 8 and 16. And pretty soon you have billions of microscopic nanites. And then maybe you program it to make a flat screen TV. So once there's a billion of them, boom, within a few minutes, they layer by layer, molecule by molecule, build you a flat screen TV. And, that's how they would work. And I thought, am I going too far? I mean, is this really possible someday that we could actually invent something like this? And my first thought was, no, that's impossible. I've gone too far. But then I had two thoughts from my own experience, my own life, that really changed that and made me convinced that if we can imagine it, we can pretty much do it. So I'll give you two quick examples, John. First is DNA sequencing. So I was, getting a PhD in molecular biology. I ended up with a master's, but as part of my project, I had to sequence DNA, and I had about a 400 base pair sequence. And this is 40 years ago. And it was a pain. Took days. I had to run a gel, and then it was radiation, and then the radiation exposed a film, which we don't even have film anymore, but it exposed film, this big giant piece of film. And then you put it on a light box, which would shine light through the film. And it would be like a ladder of nucleotides. It would be like a barcode, but every column would represent a different A, G, C, or T, a different nucleotide in the DNA sequence. And you would just get a buddy, and he would read them to you. He would squint and look at through the light box at the film and say A, G, G, T, C, and you'd write down. And it was like painstaking, laborious. And if you would have asked me 40 years ago when I was doing that, Doug, when will humanity be able to sequence over 1 billion base pairs in a day? I would have said, never. Never. It's impossible. It's even more impossible than breaking the light speed barrier. I just can't foresee of any technology that will allow you to sequence 1 billion base pairs in a day. And now we can do 1 billion base pairs in a couple hours.
Wow.
It's just astonishing to me. So then the second example, and then I'll stop. But
it's interesting because you're talking about nanotechnology. My first quote unquote experience was with Michael Crichton with his book Prey.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it just becomes like, well, yeah, of course, we're just playing catch up, to science fiction. It's going to happen. But I mean, that was like my attitude when I read it in your books. It was
right.
Just like, makes sense to me.
Right. And I had, initially I was more skeptical even, but more than you were. But then the second thing, when it comes to nanites, the second thing that convinced me that this was easily possible, not easily, but definitely possible, was when I was in graduate school. One of my favorite courses was developmental biology. So how do you get, a sperm and an egg hit? They form a fertilized cell. How does that one cell become a human being? And I mean, it was a fascinating course. And so, what happens is they do exactly what I described the nanites doing. So, you have a fertilized egg cell, and it swims around, and it's able to collect what it needs to make another one of itself. So it makes another copy, and now you have 2, then you have 4, then you have 8, 16. And eventually you get to the stage where some of them, based on their programming, decide, I'm going to be eye cells. And then some of them start becoming heart cells. And then some of them become brain cells. And ultimately, this one cell, leads to 100 billion neurons organized in a way to create consciousness in a human baby. And it just, and I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, that's exactly what I described the nanites doing. If you throw them into a ground and they create a TV set, well, you're taking a single cell and it's creating a human being that's conscious, which is a much better trick than a television set. And so, if nature has already demonstrated that nanotechnology can work exactly the way that I was writing about it.
Yeah. That's amazing. And that's, I said, I really enjoyed both of your books. And I think anybody listening to this too, if they're not familiar with you as an author, plus a lot of people that listen to this, because somebody I want to introduce you to, Joe Montaldo, who owns United Public Radio Network. He's got a show which is called UFO Undercover. He's got 3 major shows. That's one of them, where he's been discussing the whole subject of ufology for, 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of the most knowledgeable people in this subject, and he himself does various projects on his own research. But I definitely introduce you to him. But it's amazing that a lot of the people who will be listening to this podcast will already be open to this and will probably be very much your audience to enjoy this book. So, and also you talk about an attitude that I got from you on both the books, which I found really refreshing, is a whole concept that we're doing better now than we were, in the past. But media would have you think otherwise, and also political officials, some would have you think otherwise, that things are worse and that it's a doom and gloom scenario, and that's why you need to buy my philosophy or my form of government or my this or that. But in actual fact, due to technology, things are getting better. Can you discuss that a little bit? Because you referred to 3 books: The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker, and Abundance by Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler?
Yeah, Diamandis, yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Yeah, so explain that a bit, because your optimism just kind of like rings loud and clear on our future and that things are better. But you had a bunch of great stats that you referenced, and your story obviously leads to that we're gonna solve this enigma of life on planet Earth ultimately and come out on top.
Yeah, I would love to. This is another, you're hitting on 2 of the things now that I'm most passionate about: UFOs, now that I've become a believer, and I've been passionate about this subject for a long time. So, right now, dystopia is a big deal in science fiction. Everybody's writing about post-apocalyptic stuff, and that's fine. I mean, it's some real entertaining stuff, but I've always, been very, very hopeful about our future. And you're right. We have 24/7 news cycles and endless social media, and we're getting bombarded with news all the time. And what gets clicks and what gets eyeballs? Disaster. I mean, panic sells, fear sells, disaster sells. I mean, it's simple as that. It always has. And we kind of evolved for that to happen. I mean, evolution has seen to it that we care more about disaster than hope, about bad news than good news. So just to give an example, which I've actually given in one of my novels, if you were a primitive walking through the savannah and you heard a rustle in the grass, okay, you heard a rustle in the grass. Well, you can assume it's just the wind and just keep on walking. Or you can assume maybe it's a tiger stalking me and I better get my spear ready. Well, if you assume it's the wind and ignore it, you could be dead. If you assume it's a tiger and you have your spear ready and it turns out to be the wind, no big deal. So, evolution for us to get to the top of the food chain has made us, super attentive to things that might kill us. And the news take advantage of that. And they're constantly have doom and gloom, like you said. The sky is always falling, always, and yet it never falls. And we don't remember, every time there's a new administration, the world's coming to an end. Every time, it's just every second, in my view. I know I'm exaggerating, but not by much. And it's kind of depressing. If you remember, Thomas Malthus in 1798 was famous for predicting we were going to run out of food supply, that the population. Yeah. And this guy, he wrote a treatise saying the population is growing so fast that we're going to outstrip our food supply and we're all going to starve to death. Now, there were other guys at the time who wrote treatises saying the opposite, that we would improve farming, which is what happened. We did improve farming and it never came to pass. But those guys aren't famous. We don't even know who those guys are anymore, unless you really do the research. But we remember Malthus, he's famous. So, if you want to be famous, panic everybody. I'm actually, like I said, John, I'm a little bit long-winded, but I'm actually getting to answer your question. So I think we tend to, as a species, we overestimate the difficulty of a crisis. We overestimate a crisis and we underestimate human ingenuity in a big way. And my favorite example of this is New York City in 1860. So the mayor, the city was growing gangbusters, and he wanted to know what the city was going to be like in 100 years. And so he hired some experts, and they came back and said, we've got a big problem, an insurmountable problem. At the rate of growth, we're going to have so many humans. In order to make this a viable city, we're going to need so many horses for travel that the entire city, every inch of New York City, will be knee-deep in horse manure. Knee-deep. And there's no way around it. Well, of course, in 1960, 100 years later, horse manure wasn't a problem. I mean, it's laughable but nobody back then could envision the car.
Right.
So these problems that we think are insurmountable today are, child's play 30 years or 40 years later, and that happens a lot. And yet every time we think, oh no, we're finally beat, we can't. So that's one of the reasons I'm super optimistic that we can't even imagine what's going to get us out of a problem. And we're very, very, creative and ingenious. So back to your question, finally. Apologies, John. You wind me up. You can't stop me. Especially about this, because I'm super passionate about it.
Yeah.
The world is better than it's ever been on almost every dimension. I mean, it's inarguable. I mean, if you look at the statistics, and I'll read some of them to you, it's better than it's ever been. And at the same time, the future is the brightest it's ever been. We're more pessimistic than ever. So why is that? Well, we talked about the news and the social media and stuff like that. But a guy named Hans Rosling, who he passed away recently, but he was a medical doctor who did a bunch of TED Talks, and millions of people listened to him. And he wrote a book called Factfulness, which I'll quote from a little bit here. But he tested thousands and thousands of people around the world, and he asked them really simple. He had like a multiple choice questionnaire, like, hey, how is poverty? Is it better than it was 50 years ago? Worse than it was? That kind of question. How is literacy? How is, whatever, 100 different dimensions. And it turns out that everybody gets it wrong. Humans get it hugely wrong. They all flunk the test. In fact, he joked that if you trained a chimp to just randomly point his finger at an answer, the chimp would do better than the humans. And not only do better, but when the chimp was wrong, it would be wrong randomly. Humans are always wrong in the more pessimistic direction. Every group of people he polled think the world is more frightening, more violent, and more hopeless than it really is. And he talked to teachers, scientists, journalists, political decision makers. I mean, people who are really smart. He said the people who did the worst, Nobel laureates and medical researchers. And so it's not about intelligence. It's not that these people are stupid. It's just that they're getting kind of brainwashed and inundated with this pessimism, and it's kind of seeping into our culture, which I think is dangerous. So he surveys around the world show that things are the best it's ever been, and we're the most pessimistic. So 90% of Swedes think the world's getting worse rather than better. 94% of Americans think that things are getting worse. I mean, you can't even get 94% of people in America to believe that the sun sets in the west. I mean, 94% is a huge number. So, and all the time it's the opposite. So just to give an example, or, a few examples, in 1950, 75% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. 75%. Now it's 10%. So it's gone from 75% in 1950 to 10% now. And most people think it's the opposite. I mean, that's just astonishing to me that we have this kind of immense improvement. And most people think that poverty is the worst it's ever been right now. So
but that, like you said, that's your social media. That's the media because now you got cameras, you can zero in on that little village in anywhere planet Earth and see how bad it is. And you can even have news channels that go ahead and after some type of a skirmish, they can move bodies around to make it look the absolute worst. Here's the little kid here, little kid this, put it right here in the picture, and you can make it look absolutely worse. So you actually paint that picture that people will eventually start buying, because you don't see the smiling faces, the happy families living in the rest of whatever that country is. Right,
they only show the bad news. Not only, but largely they show the bad news. I mean, there's an old there's an adage in the media: if it bleeds, it leads. I mean, people aren't interested in, they're interested in who got murdered and the bad news. And so, now it's exploded, and we don't have perspective on the past. And I can talk about that in a second. But so just to continue, give you a few more statistics. 30 years ago, there were 23 wars in the world. Now there's only 11. Now, one war is too many, but it's still a lot better than it was. We live longer and better health than any time. The greater percentage of us live in free societies than ever before. A few hundred years ago, only a very small minority could read or write. Now about 90% of the world is literate. Safety is just so obvious. But just to give you even the most obvious example is car safety. And by the way, this is true everywhere, that we're more safe than ever. So like in 1950, we're 90% less likely to die of a crash than we were in 1950. And it makes sense because they didn't have seatbelts. They didn't do crash tests. They didn't have cameras for backing up. or airbags or blind spot indicators. So obviously that's true. But, we also have access to more entertainment. I mean, the kings of old, they were kings. They didn't have 1/100th of the entertainment that we can access. I mean, that wasn't too long ago, even before radio. I mean, you had very limited entertainment choices. Then you had radio and maybe 3 television channels. And in terms of books, you could get whatever was in your library or bookstore. I mean, now we have access to maybe 10 or 20 million books with a click of a button. If you have a Kindle or you have any other kind of e-reader device, with a click of a button, you can get 10, 20 million books. You have the internet, which is just astonishing. So we have all of this. Our wealth and quality of life is better than it's ever been. In 1800, 40% of children died before the age of 5, for example. We've got indoor plumbing, sewer systems, air conditioning, unlimited access to clean water. We used to spend months going across our country in covered wagons, and a lot of people died along the way. Now 5.5 hours in a jet, and we complain about it. There's cell phones, and then everything is also getting much cheaper. So that's what the book you quoted, Abundance, you cited, was called Abundance. Everything is more abundant and less expensive than it's ever been. In the 17th century, only mirrors were so expensive that only kings could afford mirrors. I mean, right now, of course, anybody can afford a mirror. And it's the same with computing power, electricity, transportation, everything else you can think of.
Yeah.
And then one final point, John, that I think, because I've talked to people about this, and they go, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but now we're more violent than we've ever been. There's more murder than there's ever been. And that's actually just the opposite too. I mean, it may be true on a numbers basis, but as a per capita, as a percentage basis, the violence is the lowest it's ever been in history right now. So, a lot of people believe that the 20th century was the bloodiest century in history. 2 world wars, and Stalin killed millions and millions of other people. And that's not even close to being true. As horrible as those things were, the An Lushan revolt in China in the 8th century killed 36 million people. Okay, well, that was at a time when that was more than 10% of the entire world population. So in today's terms, that would be about 800 million people. The Mongol conquests of China in the 13th century killed over 500 million by today's standards. The fall of Rome, hundreds of millions by today's standards. And even way back when, tribal warfare was 9 times as deadly as the wars and genocides of the 20th century on a per capita basis. So, that was when we had very little population on Earth. So, if you only have 100 people on Earth and you kill 10 of them, that's a big number. So, and then finally, the murder rate in medieval Europe was more than 30 times what it is today. So across every dimension, things are better than they've ever been. I mean, these books that you cited, along with Factfulness by Hans Rosling, have hundreds of graphs that just unmistakable, unambiguously show that on almost every dimension you can think of, racism, tolerance, things are better now than they ever were.
Well, that's amazing. And I hope people take you up on this thing here and actually look at some of these other references here, because we're down to the last 15 minutes. I want to make sure that I address some of these other topics here, because it's just, like I said, it was going to be a challenge to get through everything I wanted to talk to you about in just an hour. Now, golden age science fiction versus what we have right now. You talk about, dystopian, and you're not dystopian for sure, because that's something that Elron Hubbard wrote in. He was one of the progenitors of what now is known as the golden age of science fiction. I know when I first wrote back and forth, you also had read Battlefield Earth, which is a book that he wrote in celebration of 50 years as a writer. But what do you see as the value or importance of the golden age of science fiction to where we are now? And if you're familiar with any of Mr. Hubbard's works, how that ties in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the golden age, I grew up, in the late 60s and early 70s. I'm aging myself, but reading, and I read all the golden age stuff. And so prior to that, in the 20s and the 30s, science fiction was just about machines. And they didn't really care about the characters at all. And they didn't care about the authors. It was just kind of interchangeable characters, interchangeable authors. You write about these far out machines and people. And it was, but then what really changed in the late 30s L. Ron Hubbard was one of the big change agents for this. John W. Campbell was kind of the big master of the genre in that time, and he took him on board along with guys like Asimov, who was a huge favorite of mine. And he wanted to have characters and authors with distinctive voices, so that they were so it wasn't just about science fiction. It wasn't just about machines. It was about humans and how they dealt with machines and how their emotions and being a human being with advanced technology. So I mean, it was huge. I mean, it really, the science fiction genre would have never gone anywhere, ever gotten popular, if not for this transformation.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that, with what we've done in creating writers of the future, that whole competition, that whole thing, it's born from that premise, even though the stories themselves are not always, here's everything's looking good. Because sometimes an author will say, okay, this is what we need to avoid, and they'll write a story to show that this type of feature can be avoided. So we should take a look at it right now and do that. But we're trying to, with Writers of the Future, provide that sort of golden age perspective where you've got people really matter. It's not just the gizmos and the gadgets and even just the technology itself, but it's the people that deal with it. That's really important in a good story, and at least what we're doing with what we do with Writers of the Future. And that's why one of the things I really like about your storytelling too. So a little bit then, because now I'm interested in some tips and advice for aspiring writer. So you've got, putting together a story, you've definitely got a story, and then you've got then the plotting, the research, and what to you is the secret? Like, what's the most important versus the least important in terms of putting together a story for you?
For me, the plot is everything. I mean, it's I feel like I write okay. I mean, I write well enough. I try to get out my own way when I write. So, I'm not too fancy. I don't spend four pages describing, a house or whatever. I try to move things along and really write about big ideas. And I have I have action sequences because I write thrillers, but I really love big ideas. And for me, the twists and turns, the plot itself is what I think that my readers most like about my novels. So where I have my characters, kind of outsmart the bad guy. So it's not like the characters are just better shots or stronger than the bad guy. It's I have brilliant heroes and brilliant villains, and it's like a game of chess where the hero bluffs his way out of it or tricks his way out of it or so uses his brains as much as his brawn.
Yeah. So with your storytelling, because like the protagonist in Unidentified, is that like, as the author, he sounds a lot like what you just sounded like. Is that basically you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of me. I won't lie. I mean, I was obsessed with UFOs, and I was burnt out and thinking, what am I going to write next? Because I'm really more interested in this UFO stuff, which is suddenly really interesting. And so I decided I'm going to, write this UFO novel, and so yeah, when I had the main character be a science fiction author, there is definitely a lot of me in there, but obviously he goes on all these adventures and all this stuff happens, and he, he's a lot more heroic and smarter than I am. But the things he talks about when he talks about writing are pretty much me.
I kind of figured that, especially with our emails back and forth to set up for this interview. I was wondering, that sounds a lot like Doug. So
yeah.
So where do you see as the future of science fiction, where it's going right now?
Boy, it's really hard to say. I mean, there's so much dystopian out there, which is fine. Like I say, it's entertainment, but I think it feeds into this, that we're going to destroy ourselves. And I think that we're going to work our way around problems. I mean, we're going to conquer the galaxy. I mean, ultimately, I'd like to think, yeah, there's a lot of dangers. I mean, runaway artificial intelligence, evolution, that evolves itself. That's super scary. I mean, it's not like we don't have our challenges, but we always surprise ourselves by rising to the challenges as a species. And I'm not saying, humans have their problems. Believe me, there's a lot of blemishes. I mean, human beings can be maddeningly, violent and slow-witted and ignorant, and all those. I mean, I'm not, as a species, individuals can be pretty horrible, but collectively, I think that we've shown ourselves to be incredibly resilient and ingenious, and I think we're gonna really in 100 years, 1,000 years, really have more of a Star Trek future than a Road Warrior future.
Well, that's good. One thing that's interesting in the in the introduction to Battlefield Earth, that book that I said that Hubbard wrote in early '80s, he called science fiction the herald of possibility, and I know that's something that I've experienced repeatedly with the writers of the future. Many times we've had as our keynote speakers scientists. We've had the director of Ames Research. We've had the vice president of Virgin Galactic. We've had people from JPL. We've had astronauts. They were all inspired by science fiction stories, and they wanted to see if they could make that happen, or they wanted to live that life. They wanted to pursue that as their dream, our eventual goal for humanity. And so I just am curious how much you see that as a valid point, like it's being the herald of possibility, that's what gets the scientists like yourself, as a bioengineer, being able to work some of these things out. And obviously your education definitely shines through in your storytelling, but how much do you see it as a factor for our future being a positive future?
Huge factor, huge. I mean, so like you were dead on. All these scientists, I've heard and read so many who are inspired by science fiction. Like Star Trek alone has inspired all kinds of scientists to go into science and make inventions. So the cell phone. I mean, what could be a more important invention in our lifetimes than the cell phone? And that was inspired by the Star Trek communicator. This Martin Cooper guy at Motorola was a big Star Trek fan, and he decided to make it a reality. The MP3 players, all the digital music was inspired by the Next Generation, where Captain Picard would go in and ask the computer to play Beethoven, and the guy said, "Wow, that would be cool." Just endlessly. The submarine was inspired by Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues, and also the helicopter. Just it goes on and on and on and on.
The Kindle, or at least being able to read books off of a device. Hubbard talked about that in 1980 in his writings there around Battlefield Earth. So you're right. It's science fiction is definitely something that's proven itself. But I just want to see how much you see that's, you've got the mentality of that leads to dystopia, that we're going to burn ourselves out as we get more and more. The way you talked about humanity is in Unidentified.
Yeah, it's I think that we're going to dodge these bullets and come through this. We're very creative. And by the way, one last thing I'll add about the authors of the past, because you were mentioning L. Ron Hubbard in 1980 talking about the Kindle. The thing that really strikes me about him and others, but especially like him and Asimov, just so ridiculously prolific. I mean, 100,000 words a month, which is like one of my novels, and they did it on a typewriter. I mean, I just can't even imagine. When I was in college, I wrote some papers on a typewriter. If you make one mistake, one letter, you have to go back with a correcting ribbon or this paint called whiteout that you'd have to like paint over the letter and then try to line it up again. And so a lot of times you make one letter mistake, you have to write the whole page over again. And then if you wanted to edit it, change where a sentence appears, polish it up, you'd obviously have to type the whole thing again. So the writers back then who could write at that kind of quality and speed with a typewriter with no Google, no spell check, just boggles my mind that they could do that. I certainly couldn't. I mean, I'm lucky that I have this technology, or I would never have been a writer.
Yeah, just as a point of that, on Mission Earth, which is the last book. It was the 1.2 million words, became 10 volumes, missionary series that he wrote right after writing Battlefield Earth.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote that in 8 months. He had 2 portable typewriters. He'd write one he'd use one typewriter until it broke, and he'd send it to the shop for repair, and then use the other one. He'd just rotate those 2 typewriters. And he kept a notepad on the nightstand. So he would write down various notes as he'd wake up in the middle of the night and use that as part of his, storytelling for the novel. But it was amazing, his creative speed. I mean, what he was able to, type. I think it was 92 words a minute. He could actually type. That was his creative speed of writing. Just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of those guys who were prolific in that age, and he was probably the most prolific with Asimov, are, again, I just can't comprehend how you could do that with a typewriter.
Yeah. So with respect to introducing somebody to yourself as an author, I know I started with Seeker, then I went to Unidentified. We've been obviously talking on Unidentified, so I guess that's the best place to start, because it's very topical right now with the whole subject of UFOs or UAOs or UAPs. How can somebody find you? Where do they go to find you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Unidentified would be the one I would choose right now. But I mean, it is the only one written in first person, so it's a little bit different than some of my others. So, I think readers are gonna. I'd like to think, at least the feedback so far, that a lot of readers will enjoy that one. But if they don't as much, I think I would refer them to maybe Wired, which is my first one that really broke out, or Split Second, which is probably the most successful one I've ever written. But I would recommend starting with Unidentified. I think, so I'm Douglas E. Richards, and if you can go to my website, www.douglaserichards.com. I have my email on every single book and every single detail page on Amazon, because I like people to write to me, and I always respond to them. And so if you go on Amazon, just search for Unidentified Richards, you'll find it pretty quickly in Kindle and paperback. The audio is coming out. Audible's been a little slow, which is frustrating. But I think nowadays, John, everything's a little bit slow. So I think in the next couple months, the Audible will finally come out.
That'd be good. That'd be very good. Well, this has been great. I'm so enjoyed, preparing for this podcast and then actually doing the interview with you. So thank you very much for providing this time to talk.
Oh, it was a real pleasure, John. Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. Writers of the Future series can be purchased wherever books are sold in the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and South Africa, and they're available everywhere via Amazon. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Doug.
Thank you, John.